Welcome, gentlemen. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be back in Warsaw. It's a beautiful city. I really enjoy the beer and the what's that tasty treat? The dumplings. Pierogi. That's it. There you go. I love the pierogi. Anyway, so we're here today to talk about the unpacking the black box relating to transparency. It's a funny one because when I got the brief, it sounded very buy-side focused, but we've got quite a lot of sell-side here, which is quite interesting. But it obviously has a huge impact on the publishers because transparency affects them in so many ways. So I want to talk about sort of what we've done right so far, right? So there are a lot of things that have gone wrong in the transparency debate. So what actually are we doing right in transparency? Let's start with you, Joerg, first.
So I think in terms of what we did right was the invention of header bidding. Header bidding gave, I think, a very, let's say on a technical level, a real new level of transparency and trust into the ecosystem. So that was definitely a huge step forward because at the same time, in the very same millisecond, you have different pipes at your hand, whether you be Procter & Gamble, looking out for transparency, or going further into the value chain, being a DSP and so forth. That was a huge kind of step forward for sure. But yeah, I mean, there's still lots of things to do.
Danny.
Was it Ozone? Was that the right
changed
thing?
everything. No, I hate to be kind of negative, but I think it's important we take stock of the situation as it stands and deal with the elephant in the room as well. If you look at the primary stakeholders in the market, you've got marketers who don't truly understand what they're buying and the price they're paying for it. You've got publishers who don't understand who they're selling to or the price they're selling at. You've got users who are becoming increasingly concerned about how their data is being used. And you've also got vendors that are being put under incredible pressure by Google in particular, forced to work through EB, and who don't truly understand the context of the marketplace in which they operate.
Just explain EB there for the audience, because there's a few things. That we've got header bidding here, obviously, which is a mechanism for third parties to compete with Google's demand, which was a fantastic innovation, which Index did a great job of building out. But now we have EB, which is...
You've really and truly put me on the spot here on the basis that it's very difficult to pull these things apart. So I would say EB is Google's server side into which they they've plugged in other exchanges, but the reality is it's very similar looking to AdX and what was formerly known as DFP as well. So I think it's very difficult to pull those things apart and create kind of distinction around them.
Thomas, have we sort of what have we done right from your perspective?
Well, just trying to describe which part of the game I'm going to represent here. So it might be that some markets all over Europe, and I'm active all over Europe since long, might have gone some miles too fast. So just trying to focus a little bit on the development in Germany, where it's about doing some things right. We are often described in Germany as being the slowest market. If it's about adopting programmatic, I do believe that we have been a little bit more intelligent and not taking our route that fast. What we have did in Germany, and that's one thing around programmatic especially, that we started that move towards a code of conduct, where we found a general solution where all market players from every market segment, and now we have divided into 8 markets that all have written on, and we've now developed it towards a code of conduct 2.0, and it's not only about German or German-speaking countries or companies that have signed it. It was even signed by Google, and I do believe it's more the hard work that especially the German-speaking markets have done, and not going that fast chasing every technology solution that is offered by some players. This might be a better way for some markets, might not be the best way for especially other language markets.
David, let's flip it. Where would we need to improve things? Like, so obviously we've talked about some of the things, but where do you think we or your own business could do better on the transparency piece?
Hey there, Mike. There it is. So just bringing it back to reiterate some of the messages from this morning, and Programmatic has a responsibility to potentially educate more, is big picture, we need to educate the consumers more. You know, be more transparent with consumers who are consuming our technology, have that relationship with the digital ecosystem and how advertising supports that. That's the first one bit. But bringing it back to this subject, we need to open a dialogue and a more clear dialogue between publisher and advertisers. I agree. Early on, as you said, header bidding was a remarkable advancement within this industry, and it's enabled us to do many things. But the one thing that has driven is complexity. And that increased complexity is driving the lack of transparency and a division of conversation between the two sides of the ecosystem. I think there needs to be a greater education on both sides to say, you know, this is how we implement technology, these are the right and wrong things to do. And that would certainly bring, levels of transparency. For example, you said, oh, can you explain exchange bidding to the audience, please? That needs to be a common language between all of us who work in this programmatic ecosystem.
But go back to Danny's point here, right? Because you're talking about transparency between advertisers and publishers, because they're the two main constituent players. One is the supply, and one is the actual money. So, header bidding, EB, or whatever you want to call it, we feel we're constantly battling a massive player in the industry. Is that like, I don't want to pick on Google, but we're kind of there already, but do you think that they need to be more transparent about what they're doing? I know this because we were sort of sitting here, and there's been news yesterday that DOJ is now potentially going to investigate Google for antitrust behavior. We never hear anything about ad tech. But every time I talk to publishers, while Google's an important player in the space, don't get me wrong, I think most of the publishers in Europe have 30-40% of their revenue is Google AdWords, if not more. But do you think that conversation needs to happen with that company? That would get David first.
I think we are all required to become far more transparent. And it's not just Google, it's all the ad tech players in the middle. Have we been guilty of allowing technology platforms define the narrative, say this is trust, this is transparency, this is fraud, and then making us pay for the tools that verify those things? Maybe. I think both publishers and advertisers need to work very hard to take back control from all the tech players in the middle and agree on the frameworks that we need to measure our industry on, whether around trust, fraud, and transparency, and then feed that back to the tech players.
I don't think it's coincidence we're in this situation. The ecosystem, which again is dominated by Google by virtue of the fact they've got such a strong position at every step of the chain, is engineered to leave marketers and publishers with very little knowledge of their own business and how their inventory and their revenue is being transacted. I've referred to it previously as opacity by design. And I think until that is addressed, then investors on either side of that supply chain have got very little hope of understanding truly what happens in the middle. It creates a mechanism that can be too easily exploited. But you ask, I think the wording of the question was interesting, which is, do Google need to do something about it? I think there's frustration from their customers. However, those customers are still ploughing money and inventory into Google. And I think one of the challenges in the market today is that there's a lack of choice. There's not a viable alternative, or there hasn't been to this point, which brings you back to, I suppose, the point you made around anti-comp. This is all wrapped up, but I think that's an important point to recognise.
Just to, I agree to a couple of things in that. One thing I would like to highlight is, if the panel is called something with black box, so you have the buyer and the seller on two sides, and if obviously you have one technology player in between who's covering everything, then by definition you have a black box. I mean, it's just happening. I think it's important that we have choice, and that's the reason why I think that, don't want to emphasize it too much, but header bidding brought in something new, because you have competition in every millisecond in the ecosystem. That is making the difference now. And yes, I agree, it's giving an additional level of complexity, but I think it was one of the inevitable steps to make sure that we, in the future, we still have an ecosystem where you not have to, as an advertiser, put all your money in the walled gardens, because they are the only ones to give you a real kind of smooth experience. At least it looks like this, because you can look into their own kind of measurements and so forth, and everything looks fine. But on the other side, for us sitting more on the open web, we have to take this kind of challenge in a positive way. We have to define and create something which is balancing all these kind of service levels. And it comes down to competition. At the one hand side, we have to compete. On the other hand side, we have to cooperate, and that comes down at the end of the day to standards. That is the difficulty in this. IAB is obviously doing a great job in defining standards, but this is the main challenge.
Just really would like to add the following, because it's something that we really have done already in the German-speaking markets, because Google has signed 3 segments of the Code of Conduct. There are requirements, minimum requirements in kind of transparency. And the next step we are now moving on forward is that especially the necessity that you only can work with service providers that have signed this Code of Conduct has to be part of the contract that is between the advertiser and the agency or anyone else. And this is quite similar to that what we have heard from Procter & Gamble before, the preferred partner program. There it is about requirements, and we have to build up as an industry in a whole systems where we have binding rules that help us together to fight intransparency and better educate the user. And I do believe that only the way that we really work hard on accepting that rules are good, and that's not something that anyone from digital wants to know, is really the way forward to go.
So I'm just going to flick it back. I want to get back to that Google and building sort of tech that competes with Google later on, but I want to flip it to the user, right? So obviously the user is often the constituent player. Well, that's if we talk about advertisers and we talk about publishers, but the user is a constituent player in this. Do you think that the introduction of GDPR has improved the way the industry views users now and sort of has built a respect now for their privacy? Do you think that's been, it's 12 months this month, I think, is it? Yeah. So has that improved sort of when we talk about black boxes, we're talking about what does users see now, what can they opt into, what can they opt out to? Do you think that has improved things a lot?
Yes and no. I mean, on the one hand side, it's probably the first time that big companies take it seriously if consumers want to know more about the data which is stored about them. It's, I think, good thing and makes totally sense also in the things we heard in the morning today to give some control back to the consumers. It's important for them that they now have the opportunity to look into data being stored, getting this changed, deleted or whatever so it gives back control to them. That's a good thing. Reality, on the other hand, is also, I mean, politicians are perhaps not the best persons to really judge on technology, which is, even for us here in the room, who we are all experts on that, very difficult to completely understand. So obviously there's quite a gap in what I think the European Union wanted to basically achieve as a goal and where we are now, because that is a bad thing in this. We have a lack of standards, there are so many gray areas now, we have different interpretations of the existing law, so instead of having one standard, we have 28 different standards in the market.
But would you agree to it that it's a directive and as such it's very subjective? So on one hand we have the likes of Johnny Ryan, the great data zealot of our time. Like, I'm sure he walks around Dublin in a pair of robes and a pair of slippers, thinking he's Jesus Christ of data. That he is now suing everybody because he thinks he's some American, car driver that's been in an accident. But do you think that the way the countries interpret this is very subjective, and that leads it to open to all sorts of interpretations? So, if you go to Spain, they don't really see GDPR, but if you're in the likes of France and the UK, a lot of sites are sort of asking for opt-in. They have the Quantcast or whatever other vendor they're using. So do you think the fact that law's, I wouldn't say woolly, but it feels to me very woolly, that we've been sort of this kind of weird sort of landscape in Europe? Privacy landscape, I say.
I mean, it's definitely a very balkanized kind of landscape which we have to operate in now. And this is adding an additional level of intransparency, and it's creating a lot of uncertainty. It makes it more difficult for open web players to work precisely and properly with each other, and it's strengthening again the walled gardens. That is the situation where we are in right now.
Danny, you want to jump in now?
Yeah, I mean, as a consumer, I think it's a fantastic thing, understanding how my data is being collected, potentially exploited. And we have to remind ourselves that we're only a year after the original implementation, and you're talking about the reset of an industry and industries. This goes beyond our world. You have to remember that have been built in a certain way, and there's a lot to untangle in that regard. But I'm not clear as a consumer that I truly understand what is being done with my data around certain services that collect it, and I'm sure I'm ticking a box somewhere, but whether or not it's as clear as the regulation says it should be, I don't know.
I'd follow that question up, right? Do you not think there's been an over-exaggeration of this? Like, it's a piece of JavaScript, right, that makes assumptions based on your activity on the page in many respects, right? So I'm still kind of like going, how did the cookie become this figure of evil? It just doesn't make any sense to me. It's a piece of JavaScript on a web page.
You're talking about the cataloguing of the human race, are you not?
I'm talking about what?
The cataloguing of the human race based upon their interests.
Yeah, but if you look at
through an ID,
you look at the information that Google has, 90% of it's wrong. Like, you know what I mean? What they perceived based on your behaviour, none of it's right. So has there been this ridiculous overreaction from the whole industry and everyone around it, right? Look, let's talk about Cambridge Analytica, for instance, right? Everybody was doing that. Like, let's be honest, everybody in this room knows this. We were using it for advertising. As soon as that data was used for politics, it became toxic, right? And that's the reason that became a huge thing. And now, up to that point, nobody really cared about it. So my question is, do you think that we don't do a good enough job of sort of defending some of the activities, or am I completely wrong here? Go ahead.
Yeah, you're completely wrong there. I'm sorry. No matter what it is, if it's being misused, which there were many kind of allegations thrown out that it was being misused, it needs to be policed properly. It clearly showed the Advertising Association's research earlier showing the lack of trust with advertising. We're below bankers now. Surely something has to change.
Well, we're above real estate agents, which is not too bad.
Not for long if we don't sort something out. But it was the right thing to do. I just want to come back to the kind of interpretation of that. Look, putting any theory into practice is a challenging thing to do, and knowing or reading up on some of the work that the IAB TCF steering committee is doing with working with our European electorates in Brussels is fantastic work, educating them on why we need data in this industry and why we need to use it properly. I absolutely agree with Danny, what Danny said about consumers. If we were to stop, like we did with the Advertising Association's kind of panel earlier on, if we were to stop someone in the street and say, so what do you think about GDPR? Will we have many blank faces?
Nobody cares. Nobody cares.
Yeah, but there's one thing.
Now, I'm telling you this now, right? Nobody cares about GDPR, right? What people care about is free email, free Facebook. They don't care. And this room should get their 98% of the population don't give a shit about GDPR. I'm sorry.
I'm not clear that people truly understand what is happening with their data in such a way that they can actually make an informed decision. I suspect there'll be a proportion of the population who inevitably doesn't care, and there'll be a proportion of the population that I would guess would be extremely concerned as to how their data is being misused or was being misused. And I think there's also, it's worth just contextualising. We've worked in a world pre-GDPR when there's been personal data available in abundance, and we're talking about what GDPR has defined as, the asset of an individual consumer. And that asset is of value. My identity is of value to marketers. And I think what's interesting, what we perhaps don't spend enough time thinking about, is what a world where that data, could look like where that data is scarce. The value of that asset still exists and will be, I dare say, a lot greater than it is today. And I think we don't spend, we're very focused on the world that did exist and trying to unpick that rather than sort of thinking about how we can build a world which is completely GDPR compliant and within which consumer data exists with their consent.
I just want to give you one example. So on GDPR thing, GDPR isn't, I mean, nobody cares outside of this room. I totally agree to that point.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
This
What's that based on?
This guy.
What's that based on, though?
No, but
That's a
they-
Based on
dangerous
an analysis.
yeah, that's
Go into a
my
bar
assumption.
tonight and ask people GDPR.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. But what they do care about, and that is super important for our industry, so and that point I'm with you, is, I mean, taking my neighborhood, I just had recently a barbecue discussion which, really knocked me off my shoes. Educated people around me, they were like, they were turning away their Apple iPhones because they felt like the Siri device would listen to what they say and show them ads based on that.
Brilliant piece of technology. Who's running
Yeah,
that?
I was
love that.
thinking about this. Who's actually offering that here in the room? Nobody. No, but seriously, I mean, there was a serious discussion we had about these kind of things, and that comes back to I don't have the feeling as a consumer that I'm still in control of what's happening here. And we saw this in the morning. The outcome of this is there's no trust. I mean, we will see that trust levels are going further lower probably than real estate agents, and that has a negative impact on how advertising can work in our sphere. That is the main danger, and that is the reason why we have to address that. Perhaps not in the way how it is right now, because it's a disaster, to be honest, but we have to address the bigger thing.
So just one last point. Do you think that what Apple's doing then with the ITP stuff is the right direction? If GDPR is kind of that, this kind of subjective directive, do you think that the likes of what Apple are doing are right is the right thing? Do you want to take that?
Well, the question that lingers is what it's motivated by, right? And I don't know the answer to that. So I think there's some interesting considerations from a consumer point of view, and I suppose it forces evolution whilst it creates all manner of threat to businesses. And I think there's other questions that linger attached to that. I'll leave it there.
I was quite silent the last
I did say a lot, Thomas.
last minutes due to the fact that I'm responsible for politics in BVDW as well as for IB Europe. So I'm in intense talks with some people from government, and I had interesting discussions with that one. The guy that has produced the GDPR thing, the Green colleague Albrecht from Germany. Well, yes, we did lots of things wrong because we thought that technology is the solution, and we weren't able to explain it to normal people what is really going around. That's the first thing, and that's really what we have to learn, that we're not can think any longer being technology junkies. It's about the real world that has to understand what we are going to do, and this is our failure. Fortunately, the GDPR seems to be a solution that might help us, but lots of those things that are written down there have to be solved at court, and this is a problem there, looking at the different national interpretations of what's written there. And, well, unfortunately, this is in trying to answer the last question, unfortunately, what Apple and potentially Google now are doing is taking that, what we as industry really do not want, the e-privacy regulation up and running 2 years before, and is forcing us into the far stricter regulation approach as we ever can imagine, and this will only be an approach where we see 4 players.
Yeah, and this is
still existing, and this is the problem with the Apple and the Google approach.
So that's an interesting, because we straddle that line between privacy and giving more control to the gaffer, right? Everybody in this room is affected by those 4 companies, right? Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple take the lion's share of revenue in the digital ecosystem, including Europe. Like, it is astronomical. But have we created a situation now where they have more control, right? To your point, Danny, I do not believe Tim Cook. I think he's a liar. I think he's probably the worst of the whole lot of them, because he wants to push us into the app ecosystem so he can take 30% of every bit of money in the app ecosystem. Plus, they're building a big ad network. Their motives are obviously clear. So what do we do in this situation? Obviously, we have to comply with the law, right, of the land. But consumers now think that there's a fine line between the two. So what is the best course for this? And I agree with you with the e-privacy thing. It is a more stricter control compared to GDPR. But how do we walk that line? Because it's quite important.
Accept that GDPR is there, work actively together with industry associations, and be transparent towards the consumer, and don't fight each other, and move forward. And look at this fantastic TCF 2.0 thing that has been developed now by Europe together as a joint approach, and really act according to these rules, and accept that fines are necessary, and accept that you have to, show with your finger and point with your finger on bad boys.
David, thank you. David, how do you sort of navigate that? It's a big subject.
It's a huge subject. I mean, I'm in agreement with you. We need to work in terms of a collaborative way. We need to join forces outside of GAFA. I love the work that you're doing in Germany on NetID. Brilliant example.
Is this the single sign-on, is it?
Yeah.
Right, sorry.
It's fantastic work. How can that be scaled? It would be a very challenging thing to do. And, if you're looking, at yourselves, take responsibility and take the leading light in being transparent around not just these elements, but, brand safety, fraud, and those areas as well, and do the right thing. But it is a huge thing to navigate, and it's a challenging question, so thank you for throwing it at me.
You're welcome. But just to follow up with a really uglier question, do you think a similar initiative in the UK is likely? I mean, look, the logical conclusion of this is that we're in a first-party war, right? The third-party cookie is going to be sort of phased out at some stage. Whether it's Apple, Google, or whoever, it's going to be a thing that we can't use. Audience targeting, audience profiling, frequency capping. So is the single sign-on going to be the way we go? And will you follow the German example there, David? And are you talking to anybody at the minute about this? And can I help you in any way?
We don't monetize in the UK, so that's the thing. But
of course.
But again, if we're looking at it at an individual market by market solution, we end up fragmenting the ecosystem more than we already are. So we run into that challenge of, trying to enter into another market and monetize our inventory in other markets is almost impossible. Or even from an advertiser's perspective, they're going to have to go into individual ecosystems. That won't align the rest of the industry against Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple. Would a single ID sign-in solution like a NetID be scalable across Europe, for example, to solve that solution? I think it'd be very challenging, but...
Not quite sure whether you're all aware about the foundation behind NetID, because, I work in my profession for RTL, and RTL is one of the founders. So NetID, the concept overall, is owned and operated by a foundation. This foundation is called European NetID Foundation. So the original structure of this foundation approach for the NetID is Europe. Develop solutions all over for Europe, and as you might remember, the Germans are the real federal thinking guys. We have 16 different DPAs responsible for any kind of region. We do not have one DPA, we have 16. Okay.
It's a lot.
It's a lot, yeah. So you really can believe that even if we claim something as a European NetID Foundation, we have federal principles in mind. So I do believe you can go that way, but as I have been a part of the project team, it took us 2.5 years to finally sign the contract.
What was the tipping point?
Google, clearly. And the success of money they're making each quarter.
That we finally signed the contract. We were ready with 16,600 sites of written paper, pages of paper. That was, wow.
I think there's a lot of paperwork.
A lot of paperwork.
But the Germans are good at paperwork, in fairness.
Right?
There's two features of this status quo that I think kind of create important context. Firstly, the obviously dependency on there being an ID existent in order to monetize or to identify a user, and then secondly that the marketer and the publisher have become completely disintermediated. These guys aren't typically talking to each other, and we believe Ozone that marketers and publishers, the owners of first-party data, or controllers of first-party data, who are anchor tenants in the matter of user consent, need to be working more closely together in order to create value. And of course, they're dependent also on trusted technologies to allow them to do so. But that looks very different from the status quo. And I think the opportunity is to create, move from a world of perceived abundance to a world, and I suppose that quantitative construct where there's data everywhere. It's advertisers racing to get the lowest price on individual impressions, not that they necessarily relate to user attention, and to focus on a far more qualitative approach, which is focused on share of attention and qualification of that share of attention. But again, I think that's where our view is that the primary actors have to take greater ownership, and again, they have to be working with trusted technologies of different types in order to make that happen.
Thank you, Danny. Let's change the subject, because obviously we could sit here and talk about how we're going to beat the walled gardens, but we won't do it for another couple of years, clearly. But I want to talk about the fabulous work that the IB Tech Lab is doing, and talking about some of the initiatives they have, particularly around ads.txt and sellers.json and the SPO piece. Is that helped publishers a lot? Because I think you think about all the simplest things that the simplest things are the best ideas. They always work well, scale well, and it feels that ads.txt is just beautiful in its conception and how easy it is to integrate. Has things like that done a great job in helping publishers? Because ultimately, it's about publishers getting more money out of this, right? You list your approved sellers and resellers, but has that helped at all?
From our perspective, I would clearly say yes. I mean, when ads.txt got implemented into the market and widely used, we, for example, saw that, video inventory is obviously very valuable and it's a scarce resource. And when ads.txt got implemented, we saw that there was actually a decline in volume. How come?
Mostly from Israel. Sorry.
I'm not going to comment about this. But at the same time, the eCPM went up. So obviously the real owners of the content, they benefit from this. And that is exactly, that was the right thing to happen, right? I would distinguish at the same time ads.txt from SPO, because SPO is something which is happening on the DSP side. It isn't necessarily adding lots of transparency to the whole kind of process, because the rules.
What do you mean by that? Why is that?
Supply path optimization is sometimes. We are an SSP exchange, things throttling could happen without getting some real insight why this is happening, and this is probably not necessarily to the benefit of publishers in that game.
But Danny, surely that's the eternal battle: buy side, sell side, get one over the other. That's kind of margin here, margin there.
I think one of the issues publishers kind of will feel they're on the receiving end of. I'm not clear that they feel as though the situation of reducing monetization is being corrected necessarily. Whilst I'm not suggesting ads.txt is a bad thing for a second. And I suppose the setup, again, the construct is such that you've got DSPs optimizing down bid values, and curiously, you've got SSPs working for and getting paid by publishers, optimizing down the price bid valuations. So I suppose setting price, which is an interesting observation, right? Based upon, again, that construct of the market and who works for who. And I think there's again, I'm biased. I'm from a publisher, or I've worked at a publisher for a long time. I now work for a publisher technology business. I think we need to be careful with things that are definitely positive in their own right. Ads.txt, supply path optimization, I see value in. However, we should be clear that many of these things, and I suppose the other example is fraud verification. These are solutions for long tail buying. This is open marketplace technology that's been transposed onto the buying of premium publishers, again to premium publishers' detriment. They're not an alternative to active choice. Planners and buyers choosing where to direct their ad spend through deals.
So you're saying ads.txt is more for mid to long tail?
I'm not. So I don't think it's I think it's a positive thing, but I think we need to be careful with how we consider these. What are sometimes positioned to be silver bullets, when really we need a transaction ID. That buyers and sellers can reconcile after the event. But of course, that's not possible in the world in which we operate for the reasons I've previously mentioned. And again, I think that's where the context is really, really important. Otherwise, we end up, kind of talking about I suppose it's a variation of the emperor's new clothes.
Okay.
I'd love to split out supply path optimization ads.txt because they are two completely separate things, and I agree there may be better solutions in the future, but we're not using ads.txt properly yet as an industry. There's been mass adoption from the publisher side, but I have spoken with large European, even global agencies or brands who have in the same breath said we're really concerned about brand safety and transparency, but we're also not buying verified traffic because it harms scale and it impacts kind of revenue goals.
So hold on. It harms scale. I don't understand that.
In terms of reach. So obviously you're harming your inventory pool. So hearing those...
But surely if more publishers adopt ads.txt, there won't be a problem with scale. I mean, are they talking about something completely different? Because I'm getting confused here. Are they talking about buying bot traffic?
I don't know here, but they're saying it's impacting scale when they buy verified traffic. So this is clearly not being adopted by the buyer side as much as it has by the publisher side. So we're still talking about challenges around ad fraud now, and ads.txt, yes, isn't a silver bullet, but it is a solution that we should all be adopting, both buy side and sell side.
But okay, wish list here. What would you like to see instead of it then? Like from your own publisher's perspective, how would you solve that?
I wouldn't want to see any at the moment. The solution we have is ads.txt and then the implementation of app-ads.txt.
Yeah.
And I would like to see on the buy side buying verified traffic and only verified traffic, and see how that would solve the challenges we experience with ad fraud.
Okay. I'm trying to think about what to say here next because I'm getting to dodgy territory. Right. Okay, let's talk about pricing. So we've moved from ads.txt SPO to pricing, and the black box, particularly in pricing, because we were in a world where we had second price auctions, now we're first price auctions. So can we talk about that actually? We've got 9 minutes left, so let's just talk about that briefly because that's the ultimate black box for a lot of publishers. How much margin am I actually making, or how much margin am I actually losing how much money I'm making. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about that shift. We'll start with you, Joerg. Obviously, you're
always first on
ad tech
on
layer
Twitter,
here.
yeah, that's fine. No, but I mean, also you said like it's sometimes unclear who's working for whom and so forth. I agree. I mean, we don't have any kind of conflict of interest. We are just working for the publishers. We have a contract with publishers, and we have a clear kind of margin in there, a rev share, which is defined and which is super transparent. If the publisher agrees, we are even happy with telling the advertiser ultimately what is our share in what we bring to the table. I mean, it's very transparent from our perspective. Obviously, there are also other practices in the game, but I mean, that comes down perhaps again to the standards and initiatives like Code of Conduct, which Thomas mentioned earlier.
Clearly, from what David's saying, nobody's really listening to Code of Contact because most of the buyers are ignoring verified traffic and buying bot traffic. I think that's what you were insinuating. David, is that what you're insinuating?
It wasn't saying most, but I'm hearing, and I've heard it from the horse's mouth, that not
Which
everyone
horse?
is buying verified traffic.
Where is
I'm not
that
giving
horse?
you that headline.
Why not? I don't write anymore. Sorry, Danny. Obviously, you were set up to unpack the black box. That's the whole point of Ozone, isn't it? Like to kind of empower the publisher, bring it back to them, cut out the margin. So give us your pitch.
So we'll not cut out the margin because there's cost associated with technology. But what we do think is absolutely critical is that the marketer and the advertiser and those two first parties together truly understand what is happening between them. And that is the only way they can actually take a view of their working media, but understand relative performance. And I think one of the sort of challenges that's often thrown out around kind of black boxes is, well, they deliver results. But I suppose within that, there's a question mark as to whether the marketer is getting the optimal outcome or is, I suppose, unnecessarily paying for fat, which is costing their shareholders. To answer your initial question, I think things are better than they were in the independent area of the market. And again, there's still challenges around the platforms. And you look at reports, so the figure that is an analyst called Arete Research, who talks about 30 to 50% being taken out of the supply chain by Google transactions that are either doing that because of every step in the supply chain or selective
You're really
points.
big on Google, aren't you?
Well, they own most of the market, so it's right that we give them most of the airtime, right?
Yeah, that's true. I personally love Google, by the way. I use Gmail, I use Google Maps, but I'm using this crappy iPhone because I lost my other phone in Madrid. That's a different story, sorry. Thomas, I want to talk to you at the end here. We want to talk about how we can improve things and what are the best initiatives. Because obviously you touched on quite a lot of things about the work you've done in Germany and obviously the work you're doing at the legislative level. But I want to finish the panel here by talking to all four of you about what do we need to go forward. How can we improve things in the next 12 months? So we'll start with you.
The next 12 months. I really do believe that we have to change a little bit our mindset. So can't any longer be about speed. It has to be about reliability. It has to be act according to that what you're saying and not act totally against it. And that's something that you can especially see in the programmatic area, because everyone is talking about I'm totally transparent, and when you later on see what's the result, nobody is. Okay. Some are, potentially. Especially those that do know that they might meet me later on, and due to the former experience. So it's really act according to that, what you're saying. It's not really, so be honest and accept rules and build up the rules. We are now an adult industry. We are not any longer the junior, and adults behave like adults. And this is what's really necessary.
You clearly haven't been to a few Demexo parties, that's what. David, what can we do better? We've got 4 minutes, so
I'll keep it concise. both sides.
By verified traffic.
By verified traffic, I think that's very important. We also, both sides of the ecosystem, so advertisers and publishers, or marketeers and publishers, need to get together more often and discuss what they mean and what they define as transparency, so we can have a transparent conversation.
Danny?
I think David has kind of nailed it in that regard. I think the primary actors, those who are investing their budget and their inventory, making choices as to who they work with in order to do so. I think the point that you've missed in talking about behaving like adults is the incentives that exist that compel folk to pursue margin over their customers' interests. And again, we work in a market that is constructed around volume and rewards quantity over quality.
Joerg, you have the last board.
You have 3
Of a
minutes.
fantastic. Well, you've got 3 minutes and 20 seconds, and then I'll wrap it up.
Actually, what I would wish for the future is, I'm not sure if I could fill 3 minutes with that, because it's pretty simple. I think we should focus more on clear standards. I think rules, also how different kind of marketplaces should work with each other. These kind of rules also need to have some real enforcement power behind, which means there need to be an independent board to oversee that rules are really respected. And
Who's that going to be, do you think?
So I don't want to talk too much about the example in Germany, but we signed the code of conduct like many other tech players as well, and I think that is a good example because you have an independent board which is defined in there. They have the power to enforce certain things. They can call out tech players if they don't behave correctly and so forth. So I think there's even a small level of sanctionalization, but it does exist. There's a mechanism in place. And I think since this is implemented in the market, there's more transparency in there. I'm not saying this is the end of that. Of course, you have to develop further and so forth, but I think mechanisms like these are really important to bring transparency to the market. And at the same time, you have to agree to certain kind of technical standards which are clear. GDPR is the counter-example to this, but other than that, these 2 things, I think we are pretty good.
Gentlemen, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I think it was a wide range of panels from a black box. We got into every part of the ecosystem. I really enjoyed it. So please give our Hannes a round of applause, please. It was brilliant panel. Thank you.